What is MMT? It's a description of how the world works.
Welcome. Good morning to the Green New Deal session. I have with me on this panel Dirk Bezemer. I have here Dirk Bezemer from University of Groningen. There's Sahr from the Hamburg Institute for Sozialforschung. Then there's Annika Klose from the Young Socialists of Berlin. And then we have Jasper, I forgot your last name, I'm sorry.
Finkeldey.
Jasper Finkeldey from Diem 25. And we have Javier Parra from Izquierda, Unida in Spain. And we have Dario Corallo from Italy, from Partito, Democratico. And the idea here is to talk just a little bit about the Green New Deal. So we have academics, we have policymakers, we have more academics. So the idea is again to basically try to see what are the problems in terms of academic stuff, so theoretical stuff. What are the problems that we face in political terms? What is it that we want to do with the Green New Deal? The Green New Deal right now is a very hot topic because Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez will introduce apparently some piece of legislation next week. So she said that she will present the Green New Deal as she wants to do it next week. So there is a lot of talk, a lot of interest, especially in the United States. And MMT has a very peculiar perspective about the Green New Deal. Normally when you propose, so this will be like a 5-minute introduction to the Green New Deal and the view of MMT to it, and then everybody here, the panelists, will present their views. The Green New Deal normally is, the first question that you get is, oh, this is very expensive, how do you finance that? And the view of MMT is very easy, you just spend the money. Okay, so government is the creator of money, and it doesn't have to finance things, it just spends. And that is working for the US, but it also works for Canada, it works for countries like Sweden, United Kingdom, so all these countries that have their own currency, and where the central bank is basically the fiscal agent of the state, which is, by the way, also the case in Germany. The Deutsche Bundesbank calls itself the fiscal agent of the state. So in every kind of system where you have this, the government spends, and then people have money, state money, and then through taxation you withdraw the money over time. Okay, so this is basically the main insight, or one of the main insights of MMT, that you don't have to worry about financing your government spending if you use your own currency and if you have no foreign debt or foreign currency denominated debt, and if your central bank is playing along. But the central bank is also normally a creature of the state, so government and central bank normally are playing together this kind of game. In some countries it's very clear, for example, for the Bank of Canada and the Canadian government, they have this kind of institutional arrangement that if the Canadian government needs money, they can issue a government bond, and if the maturity is less than 6 months, they can give it to the central bank, the Bank of Canada, and they have to accept it and credit the account of the government. Okay, so this means that basically the government wants to spend, they go to the central bank and say, here's a written note, basically it's a digital document, I would assume, and then the central bank basically types the money into existence on the account of the government, and then the government of Canada can spend. Okay, so no taxation needed, no government bond sales needed. That's basically the luxury if you are the creator of a currency. Okay, so one of the main ideas then for the Green New Deal is that you do not have to worry about financing at all. Okay, why? Because the government creates money, and of course, if you want to create something new like the Green New Deal and you need lots of resources, then of course it might at some point be inflationary, so it kind of makes sense to have taxes going up somewhere, because if you want to use more resources and you're running close to full employment, or you would run close to full employment if you would do it, probably it is a good idea to basically take away some claims of other people, basically through taxes, and make sure that other people spend less so that they basically give up resources, and you can then use those resources for the Green New Deal. So, of course, in the Eurozone we have these political constraints, and also we have basically this wrong idea about government spending, that people normally think, especially in Germany, that first government has to tax, which is at least half true in the case of the Eurozone, and then they need to spend. But right now Germany could easily issue tens of billions of euros of government bonds, and the financial markets would love it. Okay, there's a lot of demand for them anyway. So there is no budget constraints for Germany, and even if there would be a budget constraint at some point, and the ECB would buy up a lot of government bonds, because Germany would be too big to fail. Okay, so one of the tasks of the ECB is financial stability, and if 1/3 of the government bonds in the Eurozone roughly is in danger of default, that's not financial stability. Okay, so the ECB would be forced to help Germany get its expenditures financed, even in the Eurozone. Okay, but it's a political thing more than anything else. So this means we need both economics and politics to talk about the Green New Deal and how it would work, maybe in the US, but also maybe inside Europe, and what exactly we would have to do. Okay, so that is basically my little bit of an introduction to the Green New Deal. This will not be a panel on the technicalities of what exactly you have to do. We don't have experts on that, but we have experts again from politics and from economics, and I hope that this will be a fruitful discussion. So Dirk, I give the panel to you, and we can start.
Thank you for the introduction. The Green New Deal, as I understand it, and I'm no specialist on the Green New Deal, is not the Green New Deal. There are many proposals and plans circulating under the umbrella of Green New Deal plans. So it's, as I understand it, so far it's very much an American thing, combining ambitious climate and equity plans, social justice equity plans. So I'm not a specialist on climate, but I am a specialist in finance and development. And this is, of course, a great development challenge. Development in the sense which Schumpeter defined development, not quantitative, but qualitative. We need a qualitative change in our economic structure. And this is a big challenge, and so you might need a new deal, a green New Deal. That's the basic idea. Now I'll say a little bit about this from the perspective of the Netherlands, which I know best, of course, where there is no Green New Deal plan on the table, but there is the Paris Agreement. That's the closest we have to a Green New Deal, which is only, of course, only about climate, not about social justice. And in order to think about how a country like the Netherlands might deal with a Green New Deal, if it becomes a political issue, it's not yet. We can look at the closest that we have, which is the Paris Climate Agreement. The Netherlands has pledged itself to carbon emission reductions and other things. And we already know that if every country that signed up to the Paris agreements does what it said it was going to do, that won't be enough. There will not be enough. There will not be enough to contain global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, right? But this was the politically feasible thing to do. This was the first step. So we already know that once that has sunk in, new negotiations will have to be done, and this will be a very protected process, and it may not be in time. So more than the Paris Agreements needs to be done. And how do we get there? How do we get there? The Dutch way of doing this, you probably heard about the so-called polder model, which is a consensus model of policy making. It's to get all the interested, all the stakeholders together and let them talk to each other and then formulate a policy that has the broadest possible support. Okay, so this is the way we did it in the Netherlands. Our Minister of Economic Affairs, a liberal minister, put together the so-called climate tables, which are virtual tables around which all the interested parties sit, from Greenpeace to Tata Steel, which is in the west of the Netherlands, has its plant, to other polluters and interest groups and government, and they are supposed to come up with recommendations to the government. Now, if the Paris Agreement already is not enough to contain global warming to levels that we have reasonable biodiversity and so on, then if you institute talking shops, including the big polluters, any policy proposal that's come out of that will be even less, right? And that's exactly what we're seeing happening. So we don't see strong leadership, but we see consensus policy making, which means not enough for a big challenge like this. Okay? It's like if FDR had been talking to the banks and saying, well, what do we need to do now? Would the banks have set a big program of public works? No. So FDR did the New Deal, and we need a Green New Deal, so we need strong leadership. It's not coming from the top, right? But in a sense it's coming from the bottom, because the second thing I want to share with you about the situation in the Netherlands, there's a civil society group called Urgent, and they have actually taken the government to court, literally to court, before a judge, because they're not doing what they need to do to reduce carbon emissions. Okay, and they have won the case. That was the news a couple of weeks ago, right? So we can see how in a government with a very liberal government, which is not moving significantly on climate, a grassroots movement can actually create a lot of pressure. It seems the government is probably going to ignore this anyway. Yeah, but it's hard to see how in a society of law and order a judge can be ignored, right? Nobody would want to do that. So even the government must do as the judge says, right? So it's very interesting to watch this space and see how this is going on. But it just shows how strong the clash is, that it actually gets into court, and that actually the government has to be told by a judge to live up to its own promises. Okay, so that's the political side. On the financing side, because I'm about finance and development, I'm the member of a club of professors and bankers in the Netherlands that's called the Sustainable Finance Lab. And we are interested in sustainable finance in the sense of a financial model for the economy that is sustainable in the sense that you can go on with it, you don't get a financial crisis, so that's financial sustainability. And we're interested in ecological sustainability, including global warming containment. And one of my colleagues, also called Dirk, so that would be the third one in the room if he was here, but unfortunately he isn't. He wrote a book, he presented it actually last week. He's a professor in Rotterdam. Dirk Schoenmaker is his name. And it's titled A Framework for Sustainable Finance. Oh, wow. And you might say this is an anti-MMT approach. I'm sorry. This looks at the private sector. This says what can the private financial sector do, or what should it do to become more supportive of change towards sustainability. Okay, so I'll leave it to other experts to talk about what the government should do in terms of financing. But some of the things that come out of this report, and it's a book, but it's also available online for free. So A Framework for Sustainable Finance is the first textbook of this sort, globally, as far as I know. The idea is, of course, that money moves resources, right? That's also one of the founding assumptions of MMT. Money, the function of money is to move resources to more sustainable uses. And financial markets do that. A couple of recommendations, a couple of things that need to be done in order to get there is, in the first place, we need to go from a shareholder to a stakeholder perspective. So firms need to stop the focus on the quarterly profit reporting, start reporting on socially but also ecologically important goals of their company, and therefore take a longer term perspective. Now this ties in with a lot of what is being said in corporate governance, but it's also relevant for becoming more sustainable, from shareholders to stakeholders. Probably you need to go from debt more to equity, because equity gives you, as a firm, gives you a lot more room to move. That's another thing that needs to be done. We need to get away from regulation, and this is one for the state then, but in relation to listed corporations, we need to get away from regulation that favors liquid assets to allow firms to invest in illiquid assets, to invest long term. Yeah, but if financial institutions are always evaluated on their liquidity, which is their safety, that's not safe in a sustainable sense, because you can never make long-term investments. And finally, the government must lead, but not in the MMT sense in this report, but in the sense that the government must create the environment in which private firms can make sustainable investment. For instance, it can do underwriting, or you could think of a green development bank, which provides small amounts of financing that will draw in larger amounts of financing from the private sector. Some of the things that I miss in this report, and then I'll finish, is I think there needs to be a stronger role for the government in actually being involved in the allocation of financial resources in the private sector. So apart from the government spending, that's one thing, it's also the government through this, or the state through the central bank, influencing the credit allocation decisions in the financial sector. Yeah, it's called credit guidance. And this can be used for socially desirable goals. It has been used for socially or economically desirable goals, strategic sectors. And why could it not be used for sustainability goals? So I think there's a case there. Second, and this is for discussion, the reflux principle. The reflux principle is a post-Keynesian tenet which says you can't push money exogenously into the economy, because if private parties don't see ways to spend the money, they will just use it to repay loans. The money will reflux back to the financial system. So the question is, if we think about a Green New Deal as giant spending push, and there isn't the desire by private party to spend the money, is this money not going to be recycled back and not move any resources? How realistic is that fear, and what can be done about it? Do we need to be afraid of the reflux principle? That's an issue for discussion, I think. Thank you.
Should I just continue? Okay. I think I'd like to start with a question, with a very naive question in this room. Why are we discussing climate change and environmental distress at a conference about monetary theory? This might be very clear to you and other people who are trained in MMT, but it is really a strange combination. And I think this points to some obstacles in the course of what the first Dirk said about the idea of a Green New Deal, which basically I would call something like a policy adherent to MMT, which I've learned before and you learned yesterday.
Could you speak up a bit?
Which I've learned today and yesterday. Don't mention to MMTers that MMT might be a policy. So I know MMT is not a policy, it's a description, but Green New Deal is some kind of a MMT-based policy. And I think there are three major obstacles in the idea of, let's say very frankly, getting voting majorities for something like the Green New Deal. Okay? And the first is that MMT with the Green New Deal reframes the problem. In the context of MMT with climate change and ecological disasters are framed as financial problems, basically, as problems of investment. And this is really in conflict with how the political left you want to address in the first step with the Green New Deal. Right now, the Green New Deal is a project which should gather the democratic voters to MMT-based politicians. So, and these political left is used to talk about climate change and ecological distress in terms of cultural change, in terms of changing our attitudes, and they are very, very used to defend their position on moral grounds against economic arguments. So MMT intervenes and says, no, that is basically a question of economics, and it is a question of money. You need investment for the transformation, of course, the transformation of agriculture, the transformation of energy efficient construction, and so on and so on. Everything is on the table right there. And secondly, and this is, I think, the really where an MMT-based Green New Deal really gets interesting, you need a lot of money for the compensation of those parts of the population that feel or will feel that they are the losers of this transformation. This might be where we need even more money than for the transformation itself. And this is an obstacle because to do that, you need to understand some description, you need to take over a description of the monetary system that is extremely counterintuitive. And you cannot stress that enough. I mean, not everyone is paid to think about the money system all day. This is really a privilege. Some of us have. But if you're not paid to think about the monetary system all day, you really have to understand, I think, how difficult it is to switch to a really RMT perspective. Let's take just things like financial assets are liabilities. Money is really a liability of the banking system. Money is created when banks extend loans, and etc., etc. This is really in conflict, and not only in economics, which you all know best, but also in conflict with the major traditions of our political discourse, which you could call liberalism and Marxism. Both major traditions of our political discourse assume that growth comes first, finance follows. It's everything, you have to put effort into the economy. You know, Immanuel Kant famously defined money as a measure for effort, basically. And this idea that money follows production, follows labor, follows hard work, is really a really fundamental conception, and MMT crosses that, tackles that. And so basing a policy prescription on this demands a voting majority to a fundamental shift of perception of the political reality. So MMT is not just an economic theory, it is really a paradigm shift of how we conceptualize the relation of politics and economics, and this is really hard. And I'll cut something out for the discussion. This accumulates in a third obstacle. To do that, to change the public's perception of money, and then to reframe the problem of climate change and ecological disasters to money is not the problem but the solution, right? You have to make clear that money is a field of political debate, of political struggle. That money is a means to move resources and not a measure of effort, not something that comes out of something that you have to work for first, right? And this is really strange because when you look at the topics, my parents who were in the early Green movement or my grandparents who were all life social democrats, the topic they fought for, they didn't fight for a different monetary order. Money was only a topic in these political struggles as wealth, as something to redistribute or to rechannel, but not as an instrument one could bargain over how to use it, who should create money for which purpose. This is not a traditional topic of our political discourse, and to change that is really, really difficult. So I think when we talk about the Green New Deal, above all, we must finance the transformation, compensate those who get left behind. This is really important, and ensure people that both steps are possible. And this can be only achieved by treating money no longer as a neutral measure of something or a neutral measure of economic value, somehow resulting from labor or growth, but as a social and political tool to allocate resources. But to achieve that, we have a very long way to go, I think. And as you all know, Keynes, in the long run, we are all dead. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Annika Klose. I am 26 years old and the leader of the Young Socialists here in Berlin. It's a youth organization of the Social Democratic Party here in Berlin. And I'd like to take a more, I'd say, probably more unusual point of view for this conference, a little bit more political maybe, in a way of, I want to address this topic a little bit more broadly. Climate change is, I would say, the one big topic for the young generation. We see every Friday at the moment big strikes and protests of students from school who are not going to school but instead protesting, students who are not going to university but protesting. It's called Fridays for Future, because we fear and we know that if we don't change something in a broad sense on how our system works, our society works, our system of production works, then when we get old, we're not gonna have this planet as it is today. The nature and our natural resources are gonna be destroyed, and we really fear for our future and for this planet's future. So we really fight for sustainability, and I think that to prevent the climate catastrophe that we are facing, we need a new Green Deal. But Green Deal meant as, well, a new deal it comes from a card game. It means mixing the set of cards in a new way. And I think it's actually what we need. Because, of course, money matters, that's not a question, but what matters also is capital and the means of production. And what I mean with that is that the problem is that in a capitalist system, of course, production is, it always follows where you can gain profits. And that's, of course, the controversy we're facing. That if you only use money for having incentives on spending, then it's still the system works that only that is produced what is profitable. And if we, for example, look at the automobile industry, we see that the change that's happening there is way too slow. Well, the financial incentives or maybe even the laws that are passed right now, they're just not strong enough. It's not happening fast enough as we need it. If we want to stop climate change right now, we need radical measures. And by that I mean having a new deal which is also addressing capitalist structures. We need to talk about where we want to spend our resources, and that of course is money, but it's also time, it's ecological resources, and we have to look at this broader picture, I'd say. So a new deal, a Green New Deal, would mean to address all of these questions. And that doesn't mean that we don't need to look at money. Of course we do, because of course the state and our democracy is going to have to play a big role at that. But I think we need to overcome looking at one point economy and at the other at politics, and thinking about, well, politics is setting the roles for the economy. We have to think about it together. So I'd say we have to look at how we're producing and change the way in which production is organized. So what we need to do is to look at our production and see that we as people who are working, we have developed new abilities. Right now, if we look at how labor is organized, we see that a major change is happening in the companies. That people are able to relate what they are doing themselves, like their own tasks, to a broader picture. Meaning that you don't have really the capitalist in the company who tells everyone what they need to do. No, the people are now self-reliable in their work. They have to think about, how am I and is my work profitable for the company? And have to show the capitalist or like the manager how they are profitable to the company. It means they are able to relate their own work to market procedures and see and show like how it works. So what we need to do is to take this ability, which is new, I'd say, and make it possible for people to not only relate their own work to are they profitable or not, but also are they sustainable or not, which means that we need to give them the freedom of not only working for the capital but for our society. But for that, of course, that is not a capitalist way of thinking. I don't say we need to completely abolish market structures. That's not what I'm saying, but I'm saying that we need to address property we need to think about how does property work for our society and make it possible for people to work for our society, for a sustainable society. So, and for that, of course, we need reforms, big reforms, and they're not only going to come probably from democracy, how it works right now, which means we need like democracy within the economy, democracy within the businesses, more democracy there, but we also need, of course, strong governments which are able to spend, first of all, on a sustainable infrastructure, of course, and second of all, to make it possible to have this change in our means of production and our production structure. Of course, we're going to need money for that, but for that we also need to think outside the box and outside what is profitable or not, and does it harm our economy in a capitalist way? Because if we don't stop only this kind of thinking, well, there's not going to be much economy left in probably 100 years for us and not much future to build on. So I would call for, well, yeah, just not just thinking about incentives and something like, I don't know, what's it called, the certificate trades and how the economy can be structured after like market measures, but to think more radically and to join the young generation in their protest and broaden the picture.
Good morning. This morning I took my bicycle to come here, as I usually do. I've done so for actually since I learned how to cycle, and I might do so for the next 40, let's be optimistic, 50 years. But cycling in this city is not easy. You have very few cycle lanes. Some of you are very aware of the potholes. So at certain intersections you see white painted cycles that are, for those who know, for those who probably don't know, those cycles represent, cyclists who died in fatal accidents. So what's probably better is to take the metro. But what you face in this city oftentimes, especially during the week, you will have overcrowded carriages, a lack of carriages, and 1/3 of them are currently under service. So you have a public transportation crisis and missing cycle lanes. This is not a phenomenon that we only see in Berlin, especially in other big metropolises such as Paris. Sometimes it is healthier to sit on your couch than to go jogging. So sometimes the municipality particularly advises you not to go running. So if this happens in Germany, if this happens in France, we can be pretty sure that the what we call the European periphery has not the measures in place that need to be taken in order to go to a green transition. Thinking of it at a more deeper level, what we see today is that capitalism and the fossil fuel industry are very much linked. We see that from the inception of the Industrial Revolution. Those two go together. So we see a financial crisis, we see an ecological crisis, but I'm sure some of you will join me. Unfortunately, we don't see a crisis of fossil fuel capitalism. Because just 2 years after the Paris Climate Agreement in 2007, the number of emissions from fossil fuels coming from coal, oil and gas were at a historical peak. So we are at a conjuncture where something almost dramatic needs to be happening. And what I'm part of is a movement called Diem 25, And this movement has started off as a movement, but then decided also to take the step of putting forward a comprehensive political program which has at its centerpiece a European Green New Deal. Because actually there's the insight, well, it would be nice if you had a green Berlin, a greener Paris, but it needs something more systemic than just greening one or the other city. So I join you in saying that communities that stand something to lose from a green transition, for instance, coal-dependent communities, need our assistance. The Green New Deal should also pave the way for a jobs guarantee that then ensures that jobs go to we create jobs that are actually needed in a society. I cannot reiterate that enough. Low emission mobility should also incentivize infrastructure in walking, cycling, and I know that there are already very good cycle lanes in Copenhagen and Vienna, and I dream of them every night. And public transport and inland waterways. Now, in order to shift to that, we also need to move away from big industry practices and redirect subsidies that currently go into agricultural policy to a more organic, more vegetable preferring farming and research. Part of this New Deal that we are proposing, and not just us, but 8 other political parties in Europe join us with the very same program. Quite an exciting process, I find, and we are open to welcoming new parties and movements to that Green New Deal. We also propose a progressive carbon tax based on the level of development in each of the countries. Additionally, we propose a carbon border tax, which would raise the price of carbon-produced goods from outside the EU to help firms reduce their climate impact while remaining competitive in Europe. And we also need to lower the number of certificates, carbon certificates, that pollution gets more expensive and emissions are actually reduced. So now, a Green New Deal is, I think, not just an economic tool, it is also a political tool. And I think a very hopeful one in a world where sometimes we feel that it leans towards dystopia. So I think the Green New Deal is also a way of inviting us to be hopeful about the future and believing that not just cycle lanes can be constructed for me, but that something systemic will emerge.
Good morning. First of all, I want to thank the organizers of this conference, the invitation to be able to participate here today. I would also like to congratulate you because this conference will make important contributions to the debates that we have to take to conquest economic and political sovereignty in our countries. Europe and the world go through one of the most dangerous moments in its history, and certainly the most dangerous since the Second World War. The process of globalization that began with the fall of the socialist camp was truncated with the crisis of 2007. Globalization produced, on the one hand, the deindustrialization and the structural unemployment in the countries of the capitalist center, and on the other hand, the industrialization of many countries of the periphery, mainly in Asia. Because of this, we are seeing a restructuring of the capitalist West. The main evidence of this are the Brexit in the United Kingdom, Trump's victory in the United States, or the rise of fascism in many Western countries. So we have the following elements. 1. Globalization has died, understood as the total internationalization of the entire economic process. 2. There has been a boom of the semi-periphery with the displacement of the production to the countries of East Asia. 3. We are in the midst of a direct political clash in many countries and also between blocks of power, which leads to a geopolitical situation of ever-increasing tensions. And finally, the postmodern dream of global governance has ended. Therefore, the only valid way is to focus our discourse on the recovery of sovereignty, which is precisely what this conference does. In this context is in which the proposal of the Green New Deal arises aimed at transforming the productive model with a public intervention of the state. But this requires a strong public investment that is impossible to carry out in the countries of the European Union by the imposition of the deficit limitation. We must break up with the European Union and we must leave the euro. That is also the conclusion of my party, the Communist Party in Spain, since its last Congress. That is why the MMT proposals for the recovery of monetary and economic sovereignty are very, very necessary. But we must remember that in the 1930s, the Democratic Party saw the New Deal like an attempt to avoid socialism and fascism. In the end, the New Deal served to save capitalism from capitalism itself. The big question is if we want to save capitalism or we want something else. Capitalism can exist with renewable energies, but capitalism is not able to maintain a sustainable economy in all the world and reduce social inequalities. If we do not make a correct approach, within a few years, we will have many jobs in green industries, precarious jobs, poorly paid jobs, and there will be much more social inequality. The conclusion, in my opinion, should be that the political and economic proposals we make to get out of this situation cannot serve to save capitalism. Nothing more. Thank you.
Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me here and all those who came here to listen, academics and policymakers, comrades, and also those whose work allows us to stay here in Berlin for these 2 days, so thank you very much. And I'm here to talk about the Green New Deal. And let me first introduce myself. My name is Dario Corallo, and I was candidate as a leader of my party in Italy, which is the Partito Democratico, is the biggest left party in Italy. And I tried to put inside my program the Green New Deal, and I've lost. Ta-da. This doesn't mean that the Green New Deal is not a fundamental reform. This means just that we were not good enough in explaining it. And first of all, we need to have a definition for a Green New Deal. It's all about combining the fight to climate change and the fight to the lack of jobs. These two things together are the Green New Deal. So, it looks quite easy. It is not. It is not because of capitalism. Capitalism, fossil energies, involves millions of workers, lots of money, and a few hundreds of owners whose main target is to increase capital. And I think that we cannot, in any case, convince a capitalist to promote Green New Deal. There is no way, because they only care about profit. And this is why only left parties can promote that. Right wing defend capitalists. So the question is, which is our word? They have the word profit as a main target. Which is our word? I think that our word must be sustainability. Sustainability in various sense, in various meanings. The first one, environmental. We need an ecological transition for the whole industrial sector. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to light up a blast furnace with solar panels. You can't. So we need to strongly invest on research on nuclear fusion. There is no other way. We need to radically change our communication. We should stop saying that the planet is in danger, because it is not. Human life on the planet is in danger. And Earth will be here for 5 billion years more. The second meaning of sustainability is social. I don't mean social networks or something like that. Nowadays we have a huge amount of unemployed people. In the next 2 or 3 years, for example in Italy, there will be more retired people than workers. I think that a Green New Deal must be a nationalized process. National industries, national essential services, such as energy, water, transport, infrastructures. We need to subtract to the future to the logic of profit. Third, and probably the most important meaning for sustainability, is with the human meaning. Why do we permit to produce goods without caring for emissions, but then complaining about climatic migrants? Why do we permit our industries to relocate without fighting for the rights of other countries' workers? And why do we still permit to produce without caring about human rights? Just take your mobile phone. Some of you just have it on his hand. That's a concentration of exploitation. And the laptop, your mobile. And there are people exploitation. Just think of the child miners of coltan in Africa or the underpaid assemblers in China. Environmental exploitation. From the soil consumption to the CO2 emissions. Green New Deal means, in a few words, to force capitalism to account for its effects. That's all. So, how to pay for that? We need first, I think in a short term, we need first to try to change the statute of the European Central Bank. The ECB must take charge of national public debts. How insane it is to avoid present economical debts, preferring heavier future debts in terms of human rights and environmental disasters. That's insane, really insane. Second one, to change the statute of the ECB We need a common politics. Nowadays, left parties are all separated, following different causes, often led by personal interests and individual ambitions. We do really need a new internationale against climate change and against exploitation. We need to talk again between ourselves, and we need to talk to workers. I'm sorry, guys, but there are no workers in here. There is no working class. A few of you are working class.
You're wrong.
I'm actually unemployed as well, so.
I'm unemployed too, so we are two of us. But we have a huge lack of working class in this debate. And we need to bring back politics as the only ruler for Europe in the world and for the world. Nowadays, politics cannot rule, economy does. And of course, the Green New Deal is not the solution, but surely involves many aspects. And it's not only about climate change, but represents the opportunity to start a struggle for the autonomy of politics. And that's a complex concept and requires maybe a longer debate. But I guess that my time is over, so thank you very much, and let's go for
Okay, thank you very much for these presentations. I feel tempted to say a lot of things, given that we have only 23 minutes left, and I don't want to eat up the time because we have to continue with the job guarantee panel at 1:30. Well, on point basically. So I suggest that we start taking questions from the audience right now, and then we have, please, very, very short questions and short answers, and keep in mind the person that is asking, keep in mind the person that has answered, so that you can continue this discussion over lunch, because the topic is too big anyway. But I think the questions and the answers should bring you together for lunch. That is my hope. Let's start here.
What I'm hoping with the view that MMT brings to us is that we can actually take the power of the capitalists away, because we know then that we are not dependent on them to produce jobs for wealth for people, that we can do it as a community, so that we can then change our view of the state as if it's some sort of oppressor, and turn it into a representation of community. It is us guiding those people who represent us instead of them pressuring down on us. That's why I find MMT so important, because I believe it can bring power back to people. And if the capitalists won't do certain technologies because it's no profit for them, we can do it. That's what I see. So that's what I'm bringing.
Okay, thank you.
I would like to ask a question comment to
Dirk.
First speaker, who will forgive me to understand his name.
Bezemer. Hi.
Hi. You talked about, you mentioned the book, the book of your colleague, Framework for Sustainable Finance, and you said one very interesting thing, that the government through its central bank should direct finance the financial system towards more sustainable kinds of productions and modes of production sectors. And this is fantastic to me, because it's one of my, is the core of my master's thesis, or to be more precise is...
But what is your question?
Yes, this is one of the main Hyman Minsky's insights about central banking monetary policy, because currently central banks conduct monetary policy through open market operations instead of discount the window.
You must ask a short question, otherwise there's no time for other people.
If there was a central bank to perform the goals that you mentioned, we should have a central bank conduct its monetary policy through the discount window tool instead of through open market operations. But this requires the rejection of the free market approach, which promotes the conductive monetary policy through open market operations, which is impossible in the current cultural.
I think that is because commercial banks depend on the central bank ultimately for their means of settlements between themselves, reserves, and the central bank is the only source of reserves. therefore, the central bank has potentially a lot of power over commercial banks, regardless of the way they choose to technically implement their monetary policy, open market or window.
Yes,
But and so they can actually by so-called moral suasion or window guidance, they can actually influence credit allocation. Of course, that should be done in a democratically validated way, which is another big issue with central banks. But it is possible, I think, regardless of the operation of monetary policy. But we can discuss it over lunch.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, please.
Perhaps more of a meta question to MMT in general that I've had, but maybe that comes up particularly on this panel, is that MMT so far it seems that the definition assumes that there's some sort of sovereignty over monetary policy. But the problem is, this becomes very apparent when we talk about climate change, is that climate change you can't assume sovereignty. You have to think about it as a totality. So is this also an opportunity to, because for me that's the weakness of the MMT, well, okay, it's great if you have sovereignty, but first of all, most countries in the EU, and then it's usually the countries, the poor countries, the peripheries who get fucked over in the end. Or, Germany ships off all its rubbish to Asia, and then they have dirty rivers in Asia where, whatever. Okay, I'm getting to polemic. But my point is this also an opportunity to try to rethink this definition of MMT so that it moves beyond sovereignty? This dependency on sovereignty, sovereign control over monetary policy.
Yeah. So if the eurozone is sovereign in a monetary sense, so also blocks of states can act as sovereign entities who can deal with climate change. It's the rules under which the eurozone operates that you may have questions about. The question is not can they do what they want in a monetary sense. So it doesn't have to be sovereignty of nation states, it can also be sovereignty of blocks of states that we talk about. And then the same analysis would apply, I would think.
Yes, I think, Dirk, that you have already 2 people at your table for lunch.
Get a big table.
Maybe over there, Jasper.
Yeah, my first question for you, Dirk, actually. I find there's a lot of interesting people here, and this is maybe the first European MMT conference of any size. And I think it would be really great, I'd like to know if you agree and if the audience agrees, that we could carry these discussions forward online. And the question is whether either with a conference website or through some other online presence that we could create a social media discussion facility. Like you can take open source social media units and plug them into a website essentially, so that this could continue, whether that might be possible. And then I have a question for the leftists on the panel, and in fact in the room. Whenever somebody starts ranting that we need to stop being focused on profit and be concerned on other things, I have a meltdown inside, because profit is nothing more than a firm having its revenues exceed its costs. It's just an accounting necessity. It's not a moral question. A firm cannot lose money. It has to close down if it consistently loses money over time, right? So what we need to do actually is make it more profitable to do the right thing than the wrong thing, and by changing the financial incentives so that companies can make money by delivering what we really need. They have to make profit or they go fucking broke. So my question is, when are the leftists finally going to understand this and reframe what they talk about?
Okay. Okay, so your first question. Let me ask the audience, who wants to continue this discussion online on social media? Okay, so we can see what we can do. So on the conference website, mmtconference.eu, we'll put up some kind of notice when we have figured something out, and then we can discuss it on Facebook, on Twitter, on other websites. But please give us some time to make this happen, because we will try to make this happen using other MMT organizations, so that we basically do this as a joint effort, and that will take some time to arrange. But thank you for the suggestion. I think it's a very good one. And now over to the questions addressed to you guys.
I'll be very brief. I welcome your comment. Where are you? The social media and actually the revenues, the profits. I've recently read a paper which was entitled "Green New Deal versus post-growth." And I think we are dealing with almost like a false dilemma, because what we see in neoliberal capitalism, there's almost no growth since the 70s. There's growth in financial markets and financialization, but on a whole, especially Western societies, are not growing as much. So I think you would agree with me that the wrong things are growing, and that maybe the growth paradigm, and I see, and I know that a lot of leftists will disagree with this, the growth paradigm or post paradigm has almost become like a fetish. We must focus or refocus more on what should grow and give the right incentives for what we need. So I think the Green New Deal answers exactly that, and I do think that a green enterprise doing a good job should grow as much as fossil fuel industries should go down the drain.
I would give priority to Annika if you want to speak up. If you want to speak, you can speak. Otherwise, I would.
Okay. Well, the question about profits. I think you're right when we're talking about a capitalist market system. Of course, it works that way. But if we think about like how to reform it or restructure it, you could also think about how to subsidize, for example, means like where sustainable production. Like how to, for example, of course, you always need somewhere to gain capital, which you can invest again in infrastructure and in production and so on. Maybe in production which is not profitable in a way that you would say it makes surplus profit. But I think that there are ways where we can have a society where we can subsidize and take profits from where they're made. Why should the companies who make so much profits keep all of them? I think if we need to rethink our way of economy, because only going after profits, well, after all, it damages our economy and the way we live. So I think there needs to be a way. And of course, I think that the owner of a business or whatever, they don't want to give away their profits, for sure. We see in a globalized economy that every measure is taken in order to avoid taxes and so on. So I think what we need is like the state to intervene, and the nation states, or if we're talking on a European level, maybe on the European level, to intervene and to make sure that the profits don't go abroad somewhere to tax paradises or whatever, but that they stay here, and that with that we can do the substitutions for where the profit is lacking, so that you can produce sustainable, because it's just as important, if not even more.
You just very briefly now.
First of all, as with the word profit, I mean the private increasing of money because of the possession of means of production, and that's unfair. You cannot convince me of the contrary, okay? And there is something that left doesn't understand, but is another thing. Left doesn't understand that to make politics, you need to involve people. You cannot substitute a financial oligarchy with an academic oligarchy.
Yeah.
That's what left doesn't understand anymore.
Yeah.
That's all. But every increasing of private capital is unfair against the worker. You'll never convince me of the contrary. Trust me.
Okay, Miguel.
I have two very quick questions.
Could you speak up, please?
In Bezemer, and one is for Dario and Aaron. Okay, so for Dirk, I think I disagree on well, I haven't had time to read the digital macros report, but I think I disagree with the point about liquidity, but we can talk about that. But someone else has pointed out credit direction, and I wonder if you think that the ECB could do targeted long-term lending predicated on green investment as opposed to just lending in the gross. And for Aaron and Corallo, more political questions. So you said that you failed to convince your party of a Green New Deal, and I wanted to know more what you think you should have changed in your pitch. What were people wanting or expecting that you did not provide in your argumentation? So, and for Aaron, I think it's very interesting what you said about what previous generations were fighting for and the concepts, and it really strikes me that like we're all dealing with sort of pre-modern notions of money. It's like Keynes never happened. Right? Like we're in the 1920s debating with people about money and investment. So it's already 90 years later. What do we do to get these insights about the monetary production system into public understanding? Because people keep having these intuitive notions of money as a token, and you know, and Keynes was 80 years ago. So, you know, so that's it for me.
Great questions. Maybe I'll start. There's an interesting new study by a sociologist in Göttingen, Sascha Münich, and he has studied political discourse on finance in UK and in Germany, and he can show. Sorry.
What's the name of the author again?
Sascha Münich.
Sascha Münich.
But I think it's he presented this 2 days ago at my institute, and it's not yet published. But he has this interesting topic model analysis, where he can show that basically the playbook by which financial debates in UK and Germany with the playbook they follow is like 200 years old. The arguments you can bring into a parliamentary debate and in the broader debate is very much different from the argumentation that takes place in the German parliament. And so we just have to be aware how persistent structures of the political discourse are and how difficult it is to change that. And this is really the question. I mean, I totally agree with you on a level of value. This shouldn't be an academic oligarchy. But speaking as a sociologist, I really don't see a way how this could change. I mean, this is always the problem with Keynesian-based politics in the broadest sense. Isn't it better to have someone who knows that, right? Give it just to Dirk, and Dirk has now power over the treasury and just changes everything, and afterwards we try to explain what he did, and so this is the not democratic way. But really, I feel what you said, but I really see the problems of making this democratic movement. So
I completely with you. What I'm asking you is, how, as a sociologist, how do you think this is broken?
Well, I've just said it's not just 80 years, it's really short term in sense of the structures of political discourse, right? It's 200 years.
We think that Keynes is sort of, it came in the 30s, it went away in the 70s, that's already all history. As far as sociology is concerned, it's actually right now, because we're 200 years ago, so Keynes is the future.
Yeah, but no, just one sentence. This is really a problem for the political left, because they talked years and decades just about direct democracy, and now they face climate change as something, well, we cannot wait 200 years to solve this in political discourse. And this is really something that this struggle is inside of me too, right? So academic oligarchy just solving the problem, or waiting for the longer process. And this is something we just have to address in our discussions, I think.
But Aaron, if he were to hire you...
No, sorry, we have questions from over there. Just back, and then it's used then.
Because for me, like within this conference, it's sometimes kind of hard due to the fact that obviously it's very centered on the Eurozone and so on. And for us, like we I'm coming here for the Luxembourg office in Tunis. And we're recently also trying to sort of like think more about MMT in the African context and organizing conferences. And I think that specifically concerning the Green Deal as well as the question of monetary sovereignty, in connection, of course, with the debt crisis, which is completely different in our context. Yeah, I just wanted to ask, like, if you have any thoughts also on this concept of monetary theory and considerate like wichtig and so on in a non-European sort of African context.
Good point.
Just as a hint, there are. I mean, I totally agree with you, and also with you that what me interests in MMT in the future is to read studies about non-center countries. I totally agree everything that's said about the US. I know this, and I know what's wrong in the Eurozone. But what we really need to tackle on the level of the social sciences is periphery. Now, and how can we accomplish these or adopt these concepts? And there's some studies going on, like University of Wittenherdecke, Kai Kortenbrock, who's tackling these. What is it called? These zone in Africa who uses
CFA zone.
CFA, right? He studied this with scholars from there, and I think this is really the right direction from an empirical perspective to go.
Okay, then it's stand up.
So I work for Money Europe, and I've been working for the last 3 years on a campaign called Green Quantitative Easing. So, which in essence is a Green New Deal, but except that we've been focusing on getting central banks and also the European Parliament on board. And I wanted to maybe it's more a remark than a question, because I think some of the knowledge is missing in that area here, because a lot of progress has been done in the area of unlocking the central bank money, because several times in the last few months the European Parliament has basically forced the ECB, thanks to our work, sorry, a bit of self-promotion here, but we pushed the Parliament to make the ECB admit that they are bound by the Paris Agreement. And because of that, now there are lots of people in the Euro system and several national central banks as well who are actually thinking about, okay, what can central banks do to contribute to the fight against climate change? And okay, it will take a few months, it's not going to happen tomorrow like this, and they're not going to say, we have the printing press ready for you guys. But there's a cultural shift, there's a cultural change happening now within the central bankers community. And I think this is a bit missing in the narrative, because in a way, I think the solution, when Aaron, what you're pointing to is the sort of mental blockage of people who don't believe that we can finance this. But in fact, if you get the central banks on board, then who else can challenge that we cannot finance it? So I think this is the way forward, to really get central bankers on board, and this is happening. Some people like us, but also other NGOs in Europe are doing this. And ultimately, I think people will get it. I mean, I was at the climate march in Brussels just last Sunday, and there were people with banners, and not experts, random people with banners saying, if the climate was a bank, they would already have saved the climate, and people get this kind of message. So it's not that hard, I think, especially after 3 years of money printing by the ECB with QE. It's not that hard to get people to understand that there's money out there. Of course, tax evasion as well. So I don't think we're not that far to get it. It's just a matter of really getting serious about it. And I'm sorry, but I think the panel lacked a bit of because we took the assumption that the money is not the problem. But yeah, you still need to figure out exactly how it's going to work, whether you work with the European Investment Bank through QE or not. I think we need to get a bit more, we need to be a bit more serious about this as well.
Sorry.
So it's
because he made a question and we didn't answer to him.
Then you'll please have lunch
okay.
together. Okay, so it's 12 o'clock. It was a nice uplifting comment, and I thank you all for being here.